event. I am also a member of the faculty of the Department of Global Development. And the topic of our conversation today is the notion of the economy, the idea of the economy with the definite article in front of it. And there's a whole host of questions around this central concept idea in our modern life. And we've invited two very distinguished scholars to help us think about them, right? And a whole range of questions related to that. When did the idea of the economy, understood as a kind of self-enclosed totality of relations of production, distribution, of consumption, of goods and services within a given territorially bounded political entity emerge? What role did economists and the discipline of economics have in institutionalizing it as a kind of distinct object of intellectual knowledge and governmental practice? And with what kinds of effects? What sorts of implications did that have? What about its non-economic conditions of possibility, the range of social activities, juridical norms, political capacities, natural processes, etc., that are considered non-economic, but for all that are indispensable to making the economy? Why do these questions matter? And what may be gained by rethinking them again today? So like I said, I'm very pleased to have with us today two very distinguished scholars to help us think about these issues and have each in their own way, and they each in their own way have reflected on and written a lot about these and related questions. To introduce them, maybe I'll begin with our guests from outside Cornell, Professor Timothy Mitchell, who is the William B. Ransford Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, where he teaches and writes about colonialism, political economy, the politics of energy, and the making of expert knowledge. Trained in the fields of law, history, and political theory, Professor Mitchell works across the disciplinary boundaries of history and the social sciences. He's currently working on a study of durability, examining how the more durable apparatuses for capturing wealth, characteristic of late 19th century colonialism, such as railways, canals, apartment buildings, dams, and so on, engineered a new method of extracting income from the future, a future we inhabit vicariously today. He's the author of numerous books and articles that have been translated into French, Turkish, Arabic, and Russian, including Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil, 2012, Role of Experts, Egypt, Technopolitics, Modernity, 2002, Questions of Modernity, which he edited, 2000, and Colonizing Egypt, 1991. Our second guest is Kaushik Basu, Professor of Economics and Karl Marx. And this is not Karl Marx with K and an X, right? Karl Marx, Professor of International Studies at Cornell University. He was formerly the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of the World Bank from 2012 to 16, President of the International Economic Association from 2017 to 21, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India from 2009 to 12. I think that's the second term of the alliance. And Professor Basu likewise has published widely in the areas of development economics, industrial organization, game theory, and welfare economics, and is a recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards, including one of India's highest civilian awards, the Padma Bhushan. He is the author or co-author of over 20 books, including 5 volumes of his collected theoretical papers in economics, which have been published since 2005 and all the way into 2018. The Retreat of Democracy and other itinerant essays on globalization, economics, and India, 2007. Beyond the Invisible Hand, Groundwork for a New Economics, 2010. An Economist in the Real World, The Art of Policymaking in India, 2015. And The Republic of Beliefs, A New Approach to Law and Economics, published in 2018. His latest book, From Raisina Hill, I'm sure Kaushik will correct me on that pronunciation, to Bretton Woods, A Policymaker's Diary, which will be published later this year. The format for today's event is that each of our guests will have about 25 to 30 minutes to share some of their reflections on the range of questions and related questions that I posed at the beginning. We'll start with Professor Mitchell and then follow it up with Professor Basu. And then we will allow them to engage in a kind of free discussion, posing questions to each other, commenting on remarks that have earlier been made for about another 30 minutes before we throw it open to the audience for questions. Now, if you want to pose questions, there are two ways you can do it. One is you can post your question on the chat function, and either I or our guests will pick and answer questions, or you can use the raised hand function and we will call upon you once we get to the last 30 minutes of the webinar. Okay, so without any further ado, I want to welcome and thank our panelists. I will begin with Professor Mitchell.
Thank you, Fuad, and thank you to Kaushik Basu. It's a great honor to have this.
So Tim, we can't hear you for some reason.
Can you hear me now?
No, can't hear you yet.
Yeah, I can hear you. So, Fuad, Fuad, do you hear me? Then it's something on your.
Okay, go ahead. Now we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Again, thank you, Fuad, and thank you to Kaushik Basu. It's a real honor to have this conversation. About 3 decades ago, I made a surprising discovery. The discovery that no economist had used the term the economy before about the 1930s and 1940s. And it was only in the years after that that it came into widespread use. And ever since then, I've been pondering 2 questions. The first one was this just the new use of a word or a new word for something that already existed? Or was this the birth of a new object? I'm going to suggest that it's the latter, and then with that, raise 2 further questions. If the latter, what does that tell us, first, about the nature of the object of economics, and second, about the role of economics in the making of its object of study? I'll summarize as quickly as I can the ways in which one can mark something new from around the 1930s that is witnessed with this new description of the economy as an object. One obvious one is the arrival and development of new forms of national income accounting and other ranges of statistics, reflecting developments in government, but also all kinds of devices for collecting information. I'll give you one example from that period: the introduction of automatic cash registers so that businesses kept much more reliable records of their sales, the spread of cash wages rather than wages paid in credit or scrip, many other changes of that sort. So it's statistical, but not only. A second aspect of this development, it marked a switch from the measurement of processes of wealth, of assets, of assetization, and their unequal distribution, to a focus on the study of the production of goods. Goods as those things that are consumed within a given year. And it then, out of that measurement, not of wealth, not of distribution, but of the production of goods, it pictured a closed circular world that fundamentally consisted, at least in its simple forms, of just 2 entities: producers or firms on the one side, and consumers or households on the other. Those households were analyzed and imagined as if they were actually themselves mini business firms that could be assumed to have a kind of double entry bookkeeping system where they track what goes in and they track what goes out. And with those two entities, you could then follow the circulation of funds and do that on an annual basis, from households to businesses, from businesses back to households. So one's got a closed world. And one's got a closed world that is imagined to exist in a fixed space, typically the space of the nation. I think it's not accidental that this new way of thinking emerged in the period when older empires were finally collapsing and the world was coming to seem self-evidently to consist of separate and sovereign nation states of vastly different scales, but all imagined as replicas of one another. So in a fixed space, and also imagining that circulation within a fixed period of time, typically 12 months. And out of that, you could produce this new figure that came to be known as the gross domestic product, GDP. First, it was called the nation's economic budget, at least in US accounting methods. And it was very much this notion that you could construct a budget for the country as a whole, rather on the model that one constructs a budget for a business or a household. You could not only construct that figure, that total, but then you could take that one fixed number and compare it year on year with the figure from the previous year and the year before that and the year before that. So with the construction of this single total GDP, as it came to be known, one could measure something much more, not just this fixed snapshot of this circulation of funds through a space, but the notion that that rate of circulation was increasing year on year. And with that comes, as many historians of the period have talked about, of the period of the late 30s and 40s and 50s, of the emergence of the idea of growth. Growth defined not in ways it might have been thought of before, in terms of the increase of population or the expansion of cities or the territorial growth of empires or many other separate physical and material forms of growth. But growth in some sense dematerialized because it was a figure that began to increase exponentially and to increase, it would seem, with no sign of physical limits, that GDP was not those old kinds of growth of cities and other kinds of more material forms that seem to have limits, but something that could simply go on forever. One can argue that in turn, this new idea of growth and the growth of GDP, and many of the other changes one could talk about that makes it possible to imagine and to count this object called the economy, represented at the same time a transformation in government, both in the obvious sense that this figure of the GDP and the national accounts that were made up to calculate it gave governments a new tool to use in deciding levels of taxation or planning expenditure, but also a new way of disciplining populations, because this imperative of growth, as it came to be understood, meant that demands made on government, demands for wage increases, price increases, other changes, could be measured in their impact against this single number. And some of the early uses, in particular of the US, in the US, of this new notion of a national budget were used precisely in the post-war period, post-World War II period, for those kinds of purposes. So I think the reason this new word appears in that period, somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, is because indeed an entirely new set of practices, not just of measurement, but of policy and ways of understanding the relationship between populations, between the activities of those populations, is brought into being. I could give more examples and be happy to discuss them. And also, as I say, perhaps think more about what made this different from the way material processes were thought about before the invention of the economy. But let me let me move on. First of all, of course, it's widely known that this particular way of conceiving of our collective life in terms of the measurement of the economy has been widely criticized, almost since it was first initiated back in the 1940s, and repeatedly since. Well-known criticisms: it excludes unpaid labor, particularly domestic labor. It excludes unpaid costs, the impact of economic activities on the environment or the exhaustion of renewable resources, and so on. Some of those criticisms have led to refinements and changes, and of course, the process of compiling national income and product accounts has been continually refined and standardized and expanded over the 70, 80 years since they were first developed. The other kind of criticism, besides that was not so easy to refine, were the way in which not what was excluded, but what was included. The cost of warfare, the cost of an arms industry, many of the costs of disease if they increased spending on medicine, all become contributions to the increase in GDP. And that was in stark contrast to some of the early attempts to formulate national income accounts, where there was a strong sense in the 20s and early 30s that activities that were detrimental to the general good should actually be excluded. But it was only by including all of those that it was possible to come up with a single figure. And of course, the fact that it was the crisis of the Second World War that gave an impetus to much of this new use of statistics is not accidental. Besides the criticisms and the efforts to expand or contract, there have also been really important alternatives to proposed to the measure of GDP as a way of thinking about the fundamental measure of our economic life. These are well known: the work of Amartya Sen, of Mahbub al-Haq, the work of Joseph Stiglitz and some of his colleagues more recently. And of course, I should mention Professor Basu himself in many of his writings, urging the need to consider not just the kinds of efficiencies that are measured in standard economics, but in particular, the need to introduce measures of fairness or social justice. But it's proved enormously difficult to dislodge this method of accounting for and understanding and relating to these activities that are organized under the conception of the economy. I'll say more, as I say, in discussion about what was there before was the economy, because that's one of the most difficult subjects to think about. But if we accept that there was something new about this, and this word was not just a change in terminology, but indicating a new way of thinking about and relating to these processes. What are the implications for that? And I'll just talk briefly about two kinds of implications. One, in terms of what sort of object the economy is, if it's something that came into being so recently. And second, what's the relationship of economics as a form of knowledge to that object? So what kind of object is the economy? I think as one looks at the kinds of processes that went into making, one of the things that helps is to realize that there's something very hybrid about it. It's made up of many different kinds of numbers, ways of organizing and representing those numbers, ways of accessing numbers. I mentioned the invention of the cash register as an example of something that has been important to the creation of new business accounts in the interwar period. Many other small devices, the invention of the index card and the production of index numbers in the same and slightly earlier period. So it's made up of a whole range of different kinds of things: mechanisms, devices, counting systems, ways of recording data, and ways of organizing the relationship between those numbers, as well as I mentioned, forms of exclusion. I think it's helpful not to start from the assumption that I think one often does with the economy, the idea of the economy, is that it is, in some sense, should be accepted the way it often appears as a kind of self-contained sphere that can then be discussed in relation to other large objects. It's actually, I think, not accidental that this arrival of the economy as an object of its own science in the interwar period coincided with the development of other social sciences, each of which organized itself around a key object, anthropology and the birth of the notion of culture. A little earlier, the birth of modern understandings and studies of religion, and understanding religion as a distinct sphere of belief. Sociology and the concept of society, which has an older history but emerges as an organized social science in the same period, politics and the concept of the state, and so on. So that we ended up in the 20th century with a set of social sciences and even fields in the humanities, each with its own sphere that was understood somehow to be dealing with a sphere that sort of covered the whole space of the nation, but excluded the spheres of the other social sciences, so that one comes to study the economy or the economic in opposition to something called culture or beliefs, or on the other hand, in opposition to something called the state. I'm not sure that's helpful, because I think the forms of law and institutional practice that emerge as the very distinctive administrative state of the mid-20th century are equally processes that help create these forms of measurement and interaction that come to be studied as economy, as the economy. I should also make it clear that I don't think it helps in the discussion, as one often hears, that sort of questioning the object of economics, trying to understand its history and how it came into being, is not making a claim that something is normative or not. I'm not sure that's a useful way to think about this kind of argument. It's an interest in the nature of an object of a science, not a claim about kinds of truth claims. So the second set of questions that emerge from thinking of the economy as a new kind of object is to ask, what's the relationship between that object and the science that studies it? What are the ways in which in studying, whether through forms of measurement, through forms of modeling, or other methods of economics, in studying this object, it shapes it. Let me briefly suggest 3 examples of this shaping of the world one studies, which are common in many fields of study, but might be interesting to think about in particular in relation to this particular argument about the development of the economy. One could look at the field of development, the ways in which that entire field of expertise in the post-World War was shaped around, coincided with this birth of the concept of the economy as that which has to be managed and made to grow. And therefore, understanding development in those early decades is a question of growth, of understanding what growth is, measured as growth in GDP. The assumption for several decades that the discipline of economics knew what growth was, taking originally endogenous notions, Harry Doman models, and telling countries of the South that their growth was something that had to be produced. By working on this circulation of funds through accounts, and as that is a fixed internal circulation, that means that growth has to be funded by households, because households make a decision between what they spend on consumption and what they save, and saving is the source of the funds that will pay for business or other economic activities to increase. So the question of development became a question of how to increase the savings rate. That's one example of how a way of thinking about the economic that was built into the very construction of the economy. Certainly as it was conceived and organized in America and other countries of the industrialized North, were then taken to other parts of the world and examined as and used to frame the very modes of political intervention. Of course, that didn't work very well, and attempts to figure out what growth was and how to create it tended to give way by the 70s and 80s to other kinds of approaches. And I suppose the most interesting one is the switch from sort of macro approaches to the micro, and the rapid development, particularly in more recent couple of decades, of micro level interventions, things like property titling, and the use of randomized control trials, which are interesting too. They're not so directly related to this conception of the economy that I've been discussing, but they're interesting in that they provide examples of the way in which a certain conceptual understanding of the way in which the world works, for example, certain notions about property and what property is and how you create it and its importance to wealth creation, provides an on-the-ground method of rapidly intervening across countries of the South. There's a way in which, of course, the ease of intervening reflected the different power relations between a development industry and the places where it worked there than perhaps in countries of the North. I'll be happy to talk a bit about those in one of the articles I've written, which it actually has the same title as this talk, but a different content, is about how property titling programs worked or didn't work, and the role of certain kind of economics in apparently producing the evidence for their success. Second, so that's one set of areas where one could think about the role of economics in building out successfully or unsuccessfully the world it studies. Another would be to think in terms of what has often been called financialization, the spread of debt and forms of indebtedness, often thought of as a particular problem and of the period since the 1980s, but I think actually one with a much older history. I think what's interesting here is the way the mode of modeling and understanding and measuring the economy hides what's going on in finance. Historically, measures of GDP had a separate set of accounts for finance and understood financial movements as just a mirror in a sort of separate set of movements that exactly mirrored what was going on in what was called the real economy. The real economy being this place where goods are produced. So it was a productivist view. Of course, it included things that were not actually goods, services, but they were all treated as if they were consumable goods that were produced by firms and consumed by households. That productivist model is interesting. Partly it sort of replicates a much older 19th century kind of political economy that understood material life as fundamentally about production. A world where that made sense, because in Britain in particular, and France, where new forms of political economy and Marxist political theory, of course, emerged, were places that saw this astonishing transformation in production and the rise of factories. And having a sort of productivist model of material life seemed to make a lot of sense. But that was actually displaced in the late 19th century by the rise of something quite different. The rise of joint stock companies and the rise of the stock markets that were associated with them, which represented, I would argue, the spread of something very different from a productivist model of material life and of the understanding of the acquisition of wealth. Because what one could do with this phenomenon of the joint stock company, what what Thorstein Veblen, the great economist of the early 20th century, called the master institution of civilized life, is one could sell shares, that's what a joint stock company is, shares in the future. In other words, it represented a way of taking future revenue, that is to say the future dividends to be paid by a railroad or another infrastructure or large industry, and make them available in the present. So it represented a way of assetizing something, turning it into an asset, a form of property, with a future stretching out ahead of it, and realizing those assets by turning the assets themselves or the claim on those assets into something liquid, thanks to the stock market, and realizing that profit in the present. So it came a new way of constructing, as it were, a relationship between the past and the future. Capitalism became something that assetizes and more extracts rent from the future. It turned out to be a very volatile process, and as I'm sure many of you know, between the 1870s and the 1930s, the world saw a series of extraordinary financial crises triggered by panics in stock markets again and again. And one way to think about, a different way to approach and think about the birth of the economy in the 1930s, which of course follows on the worst of those crises in 1929, is an attempt to stem this volatility. An attempt to stabilize it by coming up with a completely different understanding, one not based on principles of capitalization, of rent extraction, of extraction from the future. A vision of the economy, as I said, as this entirely present circulation of funds, and one in which questions of finance have an almost invisible role, almost completely parallel to, but not the center of the story. It sort of works for a while, at least in the countries of the North, from the 30s to the 70s, let's say. But then there emerges after that a new way to, as it were, stabilize this extraordinary volatile world created by the ability to assetize the future, to lay claim to the future and sell it in the present, which is the rise of the use of derivatives. Which provide a way, it seems, to manage the problem of volatility created by the opportunities for the creation of debt and for the methods of indebting the future. None of that was really captured in the standard post-war methods of measuring the economy, and one of the sort of lessons that seem to have been learned from the 2008 financial crisis in particular was that standard measures of economic health and economic well-being had no way of actually capturing this new world or the old world that had returned thanks to the ability of derivatives to provide ways to hedge risk and apparently reduce the level of volatility. So that's a second area in which one can think in all kinds of ways about the role of economics in not just measuring or studying, but actually helping to organize the world it studies. Let me very quickly, because I've only got a couple of minutes left, mention a third one. And that would be the question of the climate crisis, and one that's, of course, increasingly on everyone's minds. It's quite interesting to think that the leading, certainly American economist of the climate, William Nordhaus and some of his colleagues, these are the authors of the integrated assessment models used to predict the future course, not only of the climate, but of the economy, by actually bringing together the two. And as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, some of these scholars were still arguing that a 2% limit on the increase in CO2 was, the increase in temperatures, global average temperatures, was absolutely impossible and also absolutely unaffordable, and also arguing that 6% was probably fine. What's interesting is, critics of this kind of modeling has pointed out, and for example, recent lecture by Nicholas Stern, the leading British climate economist, is that he suggests that these scholars who model the climate in this way and produce these integrated assessment models were simply doing standard economics. They were using an exogenous growth model in which climate exists as something external that over time produces a number of external disturbances that can be measured through a variety of relatively simple calculations in terms of their effect on a single future good, GDP, which develops in a linear path. There are no complex feedbacks. One can arrive at a sort of rosy picture of the implications of 6 degrees of warming because, in particular, of methods built into this way of measuring our economic well-being, of discounting the future, built into all macroeconomic models, so that future costs, but also by implication future lives, can be discounted at some given rate. And therefore the relative impact and the relative cost of future disruptions and of future adjustments to those disruptions is much lower than it would be if you didn't include a discount. Let me stop there. I think that's my 30 minutes. There's a lot we could take up and discuss, and I very much look forward to doing that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So Professor Basu.
Thank you very much, Fuad, Tim, thank you. I was actually very pleased by this invitation from Fuad, mainly because of the paper by Professor Timothy Mitchell, his paper in which I'm sitting with right now, the European Journal of Sociology, which is the basis of this talk. What it did for me is it struck a chord, and certain things that I was subliminally aware of, and I had touched on some related matters, came to the surface. So I thought it's a great opportunity to be able to interact and share with some of my thoughts, which are on similar wavelengths. I'll go into different topics, but similar wavelength, as you will sense. Also, this came at a time where these thoughts are heightened by, curiously enough, the pandemic and the COVID-19, because it is sort of tearing our conventional world apart. Even before that, the rise of digital technology is making us conscious that maybe the way we thought the world works, the kinds of policies which have the kinds of effect that we expected, are not going the way they were supposed to. And maybe there is a reason to think of the fundamentals of the discipline the way we very seldom ask ourselves to do so. There's also something about the current crisis of the vaccine market. When the vaccines first came on the market with a couple of corporations producing it, I have to say that for me and for a whole bunch of economists, it was very, very confusing because the vaccine market is very difficult to understand. Secret deals were being cut between the manufacturer and the countries, and those countries would cut deals with others. There was reneging on contracts going on. It was a chaotic market, not the beautiful, well-organized market that we economists are used to. And one of the reasons is what Tim touches on, is many of the categories in our heads by which we judge the world are categories that we have created. For convenience, maybe, but it has become a part, and I want to touch on this, that in some ways, we are also trying to live up to the created world, the world that has been created. Let me back up a little bit. The market shock to me is because I take to be, like most economists, treat these oligopolistic markets, like the vaccine market, as a conception created, actually it goes far back to 1838, and I'm referring to the absolutely staggering work of Augustin Cournot, conceptualizing the way markets meet, trade takes place. A work of extreme elegance, and the kind of equilibrium notion that he gave birth to later on would be called more generally, Cournot was doing it in a specific context, is the Nash equilibrium. It's true that Cournot's work did not get picked up immediately. In fact, it was almost 50 years later, in 1883, that there was a book review of Cournot by Bertrand. Imagine a book review coming out 50 years later. It shows how you've ignored the author and the book for a long time. That the work comes into prominence, and then it becomes just hugely influential. It creates the world for us, and it is shaping the world as well. You can see from the fact that American antitrust law, the way it has been shaped, discussions around it, even some of it in courts, use categories that are created by economists. In particular, Cournot and subsequently other economists working on that kind of modeling. This is, by the way, not true of maybe one of the first antitrust laws, the Sherman Act of 1890, makes very little reference to economic ideas, and in fact uses the word monopoly slightly differently from the way we economists use the word monopoly, which shows that it was not being influenced by this. But later on, Webb-Pomerine Act, Clayton Act, Robinson-Patman Act, very heavily loaded with concepts that we have created, and this becomes a part of economics. Now, when the vaccine chaos was taking place, corporations had made it, they had got patents on it, they were selling to some countries, not selling to other countries, then countries were cutting deal with others. This was not fitting into the beautiful conception of the way the market works. And actually, I've got students right now with me, graduate students, Fikri Pitsuan, Pengfei Zhang. We are working on trying to understand, slotting it into the categories that we have in our head. And that's when I remembered an early paper, Clifford Geertz, one of the few papers by anthropologists published in an economics journal. Clifford Geertz had a paper in 1978 on the Bazaar economy, published in the American Economic Review. Actually, it's a staggering paper. It doesn't have the modeling, of course, the way we do, but he points out, he's talking, I think it's the Middle Eastern markets that he's modeling on, but before that, he's had experience of Indonesian markets, a whole lot of markets in traditional economies. That these markets, unlike the beautiful market of Augustin Cournot, it is not anonymous markets with prices and buyers and sellers. The first thing that you do in a bazaar is you destroy the anonymity. You cut bilateral deals. There are prices, but deals being cut. It's a mess, but it is a mess that describes a reality. And it struck me, perhaps what we have in the vaccine market is closer to Clifford Geertz's Bazaar than to the economy that we have created in our models and the economy that we live by. We draft our laws by that and we live by that. I should point out over here that with Geertz, for me personally, I was very excited when I used to live in India. I was coming to the Institute for Advanced Study 1 year, and I was very keen that I would be spending time with Geertz because I was familiar with this particular work of Geertz and a few others. Then after several months of being at the Institute for Advanced Study, Geertz showed up for something, met him, and he said that he had decided to be away from the Institute that year because he had heard that lots of economists were coming and they were going to be situated in the Institute for Advanced Study. But actually, I got along with him splendidly. Then we had a couple of meetings subsequently, but he was away during that period. Great influence for me, this particular work, and I think it has relevance to us. By the way, I should also mention the other anthropologist with a paper in American Economic Review is Malinowski. Again, a very beautiful paper in, I'm forgetting the year, I won't even try, but a beautiful paper on power in small groups, on why do we give power to the leader that he talks about. Now, let me point out to another thing, that the world that we create for our modeling very often ends up by influencing our actual behavior. And one particular example of this is my eliciting a lesson from a well-known paper. This is a paper by my colleagues here, Bob Frank, Tom Gilovich, and Dennis Reagan, This was a paper based on laboratory experiments where they made different students with different backgrounds play games in the laboratory, where in the games you could be more selfish or less selfish the way you play. And what they discovered was that the economic students are more selfish than virtually any other students when they play these games. One way of interpreting this is that economics is a discipline that attracts more selfish people. But I actually don't think so. I feel it is the other way around. Having come into this discipline and from the first day learning that human beings are selfish, you gradually learn that that is the norm of behavior. Selfishness is the norm. And when these students are then made to play in the lab, most of us like to be normal, like other people. So they behave in a way that they are not innately so, though they might become, after many years of being economists, they may become more selfish because they've been taught that's the way to be. So the world that the way we visualize the world could indeed be creating some of the world that actually is, because we begin to internalize these and live by these axioms. Another related point that I want to talk about, and this I have written about, the vaccine related, the market chaos, etc., Clifford Geertz, these are all my current concerns. I hope, and now especially with this impetus of Tim Mitchell's paper, I might get into this and do some serious writing. But something that I've written about earlier, not modeling, but which also relates to our neighboring disciplines, extremely important, and we economists have given very little importance to, is to do with norms and other hidden assumptions. And here I want to point out another thing about, I'm sure all disciplines, being an economist, I'm aware of this in our discipline, is that there are certain assumptions which are assumptions in the woodwork of the discipline. That is, we internalize these assumptions so much that we never write them down as the explicit assumptions and axioms. So normal economics, like normal science, continues by new generations of economists coming, looking at the assumptions that we have written down explicitly, contesting some of those assumptions, accepting others, doing experiments. But the assumptions in the woodwork survive much longer, and they can do damage to a discipline when the discipline needs mobility and change. And today's world, with this dramatic change going on, we need to examine some of these assumptions in the woodwork. And let me give you one example from economics, which I had written about in my book, Prelude to Political Economy, is for an economist, trade and exchange, that is the sort of core of human life. Yes, the measurement of the kind that was being talked about, how do we measure the total value, is critical. And trade and exchange is what expands the value of what we live by. What leads to trade and exchange? Why will I give you something and take something from you? There are two axioms that we write down explicitly that leads to trade and exchange. Well, number one, you must want more, the desire, utility maximization, payoff maximization that game theorists talk about. Trying to have more is important. So I may use the pejorative word greed as the short form of this axiom. You do need a modicum of greed, people wanting more. But why will you trade and exchange? You need another axiom, which is the law of diminishing marginal utility. As you have more and more of one good, the satisfaction of each unit of that good goes down, and you're seeking other goods that you don't have. So these two axioms put together, that you want more, and the law of diminishing marginal utility, leads to trade and exchange, is the other two axioms of economics. Now, it so happens that in 1975, Kagel and several co-authors in Austin, Texas, ran experiments on rats, and it was discovered that rats actually satisfy both these axioms. They are quite greedy, perennially looking for more, and very lovely experiments showing that they satisfy the law of diminishing marginal utility. Rats satisfy both these axioms. There was do rats perform exchange? And this has been reported that some economists wanted to know if rats do exchange or not. I would not bother to do an experiment on this, but some economists did it. Give one rat all the butter, another rat all the bread. And these economists found that rats do not perform trade and exchange. They satisfy the axioms that we write down explicitly, but they don't do trade and exchange. That immediately tells you that there are hidden assumptions in the woodwork, and that should warn you that there may be assumptions pertaining to human norms, variety of assumptions which are critically important, but we take them so much for granted that we do not even explicitly write them down. So when these axioms related to our norms and culture begin to go wrong, we don't have the wherewithal in our discipline to examine where things are going wrong. For instance, one minimal thing about trade and exchange, which is quite obvious to us, any complicated trade and exchange means you can communicate, you can talk to one another, because we need to do that before we can cut a sophisticated deal. But in no economics book do you see an axiom written down which says can talk. The agents can talk is never written down as an axiom, and that may be fine. But there are many other axioms that we need. Agents trust one another. They have a minimal amount of integrity. When they say something, they like to carry this out. These are all unwritten assumptions. Many of them are critical for the modern economy to function. We take them for granted. But occasionally they may begin to crack up. And when they begin to crack up, you run into a problem. There is, and I feel we are at a juncture where we need to think about the implicit assumptions, the assumptions beneath the surface, most of them to do with the kinds of norms needed for a modern economy to function well, function equitably. Too little thought has gone into this. The dramatic example from history of unwritten assumptions, assumptions which very often the practitioners are not even aware of the assumptions that they are making, of course, is Euclidean geometry. This now fascinates me, not the geometry itself, but the fact that in this case, one of the biggest assumptions was never written down by Euclid, and Euclid took it so much for granted that he never thought it's important to write it down explicitly, namely that the entire geometry was being done on a flat surface. So all the axioms and the theorems you're writing down, it's for a flat surface, which means if you had used Euclidean geometry for the world as it is, namely a huge sphere, those axioms would drive us to big errors. If we had continued with Euclidean geometry into the age of flying very fast travel across the world and did our calculations based on a geometry on a flat surface while living on a huge spherical surface, we would have made big blunders. But fortunately, there were people who began to realize that geometry, as we've got from the Greeks, has at least one huge implicit assumption which they were not even, Euclid was not aware of. Interestingly, for this, you don't need mathematicians. Some of the first people who became aware of this, one of the first is Omar Khayyam. As a mathematician, had a sense that Euclid was using an assumption without stating. But one of the first concrete breakthroughs on this comes with the work of the German jurist who later became a mathematician after a while practicing law. This had struck him. This is Ferdinand Karl Schweikart in the early 19th century, 1813 or 1814, around then. It started striking Schweikart, a practicing jurist with a great interest in mathematics and amateur interest. It struck him that an additional axiom was being used. Then he went and discussed with Gauss, told him about it. He himself began to write, and actually he ended up in his last years as a practicing mathematician and a professor who discovered this. So there are these big works to be done. Let me, since I have a few minutes, go back to one little bit of economic history as well, and the construction of the way the world is for us. I mentioned again the early work of Augustin Cournot, but the conception of the world as a general equilibrium system, the way we've got it, and I believe beneath that there are these assumptions, normative assumptions, which there are anthropologists, sociologists, a prominent name is Mark Granovetter, who have been driving home that, look, you need to be aware of these assumptions. But let me step back a little bit and give you a little bit of economic history, which is, again, intellectually absolutely fascinating. One of the early works where we are getting this conception of the economy as markets working, and this, I think, is again going to change in the current situation, is Adam Smith, of course. 1776, Adam Smith's conception, written in plain, simple English, but later on people want to understand this better. The person I greatly admire as a phenomenal mind and also a very noble human being. So the greater admiration is actually for the nobility than the mind, is Stanley Jevons. Stanley Jevons is trying to understand the economy and how do prices form, the very sort of basis of ultimately when you're going to build up to the GDP, the measurement of the economy, you need the notion of prices. There were lots of conventional ideas floating about. When it struck Jevons, and we probably know the day on which it struck Jevons, 19th of February, 1860, there is a dramatic entry in Jevons's diary saying that I've been sitting at home all day thinking about political economy, and a thought has struck me now which revolutionizes my thinking. And a few months later, he wrote to his brother saying, I now can't read other economists' work without a sense of disdain because my thinking has changed completely. And he was quite a modest person. So his disdain was really anguish with the state of the discipline. So it's Jevons who's beginning to give this shape. There was one person earlier who had done things, which was Hermann Heinrich Gossen, German. I wouldn't even call him an economist. He was a bureaucrat all his life. And in his retirement, he started writing. And Jevons, and shows his nobility, by the time he's publishing his second edition, says that I had thought I had done it first, but there is someone else I've now discovered had done all this before me. I don't even know whether that person is alive or dead, Hermann Heinrich Gossen, but we know that by then Gossen was dead and gone. So Gossen, Jevons, and of course, Walras. Walras creates this markets functioning. And again, how the modern world begins to change this. In Walras's construction of the economy, there are the buyers, there are the sellers, but something else Walras constructed as the imaginary auctioneer who brings the buyers and the sellers on the same platform, who is an invisible auctioneer. Doesn't really exist, but you have to imagine the auctioneer who sets prices, and a price at which demand is equal to supply, the market's clear. And those prices become the granular elements of the construction and calculation of the whole GDP. We economists have got so used to it that we take this for granted, the auctioneer. What is changing the world today and actually having a great impact on the way we conceptualize the modern world is, think of a digital platform where you're buying and selling, whether it's Uber, where you don't directly hail a taxi driver, but there is a platform, you get on that, and the taxi drivers on that platform, you meet each other or one another. Amazon, you're buying goods and services on Amazon on the platform, you're coming together. What has happened in the world today is that imaginary auctioneer of Walras is now the profit-making digital corporation with a platform. It is turning our world topsy-turvy, and I personally believe there are prominent writers today saying we have to use our antitrust law more aggressively. Yes, we should do that, but antitrust law is not enough. You need much more radical policy interventions. You need ideas like profit sharing, which Weitzman wrote about a long time ago, and Weitzman is gone, unfortunately, from us. It died as an academic text, but time for very radical policies. I don't want to go into that, but this requires us to take a fresh look at our discipline, and the discipline that part of it has been created by our minds. I want to take literally 2-3 minutes more with a thought that struck me in these days, and Timothy Mitchell's paper sort of pushes me to think more about it, that an element of research, I'm talking about my own discipline, and I'm a great admirer of the staggering intellectual achievements, but I think there is very deep work to be done. One thing that struck me is part of research or the way we present our research has something in common with a magic show. And this does create some of the fictionalized world that we've created. Much of the fictionalized world that we create is not deliberate. No one is doing it deliberately, but collectively we end up creating that world. But some of it, this is deliberate because of the incentives. Let me explain this magic idea and I will stop with that. Just imagine a standard magic show you've gone to watch. What is a magic show? In a magic show, a rabbit comes out of the hat. Of course, a magic is not a miracle. The rabbit was put in there, but put in there in a way that you didn't even expect that the rabbit could be there. So a good magician creates a world for you where you begin to believe there can't be a rabbit over there. So when the rabbit comes out, it gives you a big shock and you say, what a dramatic magic show. Research is a little bit about that. In the preamble to a paper, we create a world where what I will show you later in the paper is going to come to you as a surprise. That makes me a more powerful researcher. So the way I write, I lull your thoughts into not expecting the result that I'm going to suddenly pull out of the rabbit that I'm going to pull out of the hat. And if you think of, I'll make enemies if I begin to give examples of economists who have done that, created a world when in the end, halfway through the paper, they are going to pull the rabbit out. So I won't give you examples, but there are papers like that where you lull the reader into a certain belief. And then the surprise comes when the result, when you've been lulled into it, you don't expect it, you see the result. And it does play a role. It sort of makes our mind more fertile, we sit up. But this creation of the world where our results and our research comes as a surprise is an exciting venture, but it also creates a world where we get lulled into a certain complacency. And it is probably today we are at a juncture when we need to pause because the world is changing and I feel the terrain of the economy is changing. It is like, again, the hidden Euclidean axiom. Thank goodness we discovered it, that we were using this axiom before planes began to fly rapidly across the world. Otherwise, we would have accidents if we were using old geometry to predict the paths. We are at a world where the world is changing very, very rapidly. And I feel the discipline of economics, and over here, I'm thinking of economics with political science, with sociology, anthropology, the intertwining of disciplines needs a very fresh thinking. And we need to step into this. And I'm treating this discussion as almost an impetus, a push, a nudge that we need to do better. The Industrial Revolution was a period of 100 years during which not only did we adopt very radical policies, but some of the most dramatic breakthroughs in economics took place around then. And now during the digital revolution is a time that we need to think in terms of our social sciences in a similar spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaushik. That was wonderful. So this phase of the webinar is one in which the two of you can sort of exchange ideas, question each other, maybe sometimes even provoke each other a little bit. Okay, so Tim, you want to start off?
Sure. So thank you very much, Kaushik, for that, all of that, and especially the historical range of your references and through so many significant texts of the 19th century, but also all the way through to recent or relatively recent work of anthropologists and sociologists, Clifford Geertz, of course, and Mark Granovetter, among others. And it's wonderful to know that economists find useful material in that kind of work. Actually, the first thing I want to do is to say that those among you and your colleagues who enjoy reading that kind of work, I'd really like to recommend a book that is about to be published in about a week. And it's by a man, a French scholar by the name of Michel Callon, C-A-L-L-O-N, and it's called Markets in the Making. And he builds, I would say, it's more in the tradition of Geertz than of Callon, but he's interested in the work that is done long before the sort of formal market of economic theory comes into being where there's a buyer, a seller, and a good, to understand the process by which part of that process of the economic involves the very construction and definition of what is a good. And that actually part of the understanding of the market process has to be expanded to think about that. He actually refers to the case of platform economies, the examples of Uber and Amazon and so on, partly in a way as examples of that kind of process, but also because he wants to argue that we should think of all goods as platforms. Or as he puts it, because of course the traditional historical political economy would have talked about so many meters of linen or so many pairs of shoes. And he says we should think of all shoes as platform shoes. Because a very important part of, and I think he would also call it the work of economics, is not just sort of finding a pre-existing buyer and seller and understanding what it is that is going to bring them together over a good, but how the very construction of a good involves that work. I wish I could give you a more precise development of the argument. It's a wonderfully sophisticated thinking through of the process of the economic by the person who I think has done more than any other for many of us to sort of transform this field of the sociology of economics. So that's a first reaction. Coming to some of the other wonderful reference you brought out, Stanley Jevons and Ra. One of the things that interests me about them, and I'm not the only one who pointed them out, is that the moment when they independently and others give birth to what becomes marginal utility theory, modern, equilibrium economics, is the moment of the emergence on a large scale of stock markets and futures markets. They've existed, of course, in some form for centuries, but suddenly in the 1860s, 1870s, in London, in Paris, in New York, one has the growth of these markets, and it's connected with the telegraph and the ability to transmit data about wheat and other goods in terms of futures. It's a wonderful account by William Cronin of the development in his book, Nature's Metropolis, of the development of the Chicago futures market, where he traces it in part to the development of the grain elevator, because all of a sudden sacks of grain can literally become liquid. It's no longer an individual farmer standing and selling his stocks. There's a whole system of typologies. They get converted into a graded commodity so that then the sacks can be emptied into an elevator and then literally become liquid. And what the farmer has is now a chit that represents his grain. So there's a whole set of technical changes that come together that make possible this phenomenon of the stock market. And not only those technical ones in terms of goods and how they're handled and measured and valued, and communication systems, telegraph and others, but also what is being sold. And this was the point I alluded to before, what Veblen calls the sort of the sudden extraordinary expansion of the master institution of civilized life, the joint stock company, this company that can turn its own future revenue into a good that it can sell in the present through the selling of shares in that anticipated future. But the suggestion about that birth of modern equilibrium economics is it actually took that event to help understand these things that came to be thought of as buyers, sellers, and prices. In other words, to move from that world that Geertz is writing about in the Moroccan Bazaar and the Indonesian markets, to one where you know in advance that there's a single, you can imagine a world precisely the opposite of what Geertz talks about, of a single commodity, a single buyer, a single price, a single seller, and the possibility of them moving into equilibrium. So it's a kind of way of thinking about the history of economics that takes the world of theory, but also tries to think, rather like I tried to do earlier for mid-20th century economics and the birth of the economy. One goes back to the late 19th century. That even larger revolution in economic thought that happens around then is actually, it's not just a moment in the history of thought, it's actually a radically different moment in the history of what it means to buy and sell, that you can't adequately understand if you don't think about what it is now that are some of the biggest things that are being bought and sold, namely futures and stocks as claims on future revenue. And that there's a sort of way of thinking the history of economics that works through that more sort of, as it were, socio-technical history of devices, of machines, of institutions, of processes. And that economic thought is both a reflection of that and also an attempt to make sense of it and standardize it, as opposed to a sort of reflection on the eternal nature of human beings. I don't know if that sort of fits with some of your obviously very wide reading of 19th century political economy, that one can approach it other than as the sort of just the prehistory of the way we think today, that it's actually located in its time and space in very specific ways.
I can jump in, Tim, to this, and also a little bit of what you are. I've taken note of Callon's book, and it'll be on my desk soon enough. I'm curious very much about this. I wanted to touch on two things. One which was quite central to what you're saying, and one you brought up a bit tangentially, and you just mentioned also just an understanding of this. The notion of property. What quite do I own or not own? Once we get used to dealing with exactly the same things, homes, car, bread, butter, we seem to know what property is. But there are domains, as you're saying, in the financial world, for instance, it is, a lot of it is ambiguous. It's difficult to understand till you get into a pattern. Today in the digital world also, and intellectual property world, a huge amount of ambiguity. I feel we need to spend much more time to understand. And one analogy drives me occasionally, make me think that, am I in the category of early people who were not understanding what property rights were when it's coming to intellectual property rights? Many of this I don't understand in my day-to-day functioning. I'm not talking as an economist. And the analogy here is with the Native Americans, who, when the Europeans arrived, there were occasions when the Cherokees would sell their land, not quite knowing what it means to sell land, because land as property is not a category in their heads. And after selling their land, the next day they show up to till the very same land that they have sold to the people, and very cheerful that, yes, we've sold you the land, but we are tilling it. So what? Not realizing that there's a category conflict taking place between two groups of people. I feel that actually property, your sort of what you were saying was touching on that it evolves the notion. And we may be coming into a world where very different kinds of things will be known as property in the financial world, in the intellectual property world. And there will be groups of people who will be cheated out, not also deliberately. One group that does not fully understand quite what you're contracting on, and another group is in the forefront of this new notion of rights, and they're going to claim larger and larger amounts. And we indeed have to be careful with the big corporations that are taking on a big chunk of the world and creating the world as they want. So I would love it if you have any thoughts on this. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is this large idea of measurement and GDP, the full size of the pie. In a couple of popular op-eds, I've touched on this. And actually now you'll make your talk today more than anything else is making me think about this. We do know statistically, this is Angus Madison's work, that growth rate, the global growth rate, the total global GDP before the Industrial Revolution, before or even to the middle of it till 1820, the full effect of the Industrial Revolution hasn't come in. If you take the period before that, the global growth rate was something like 0.2% per annum. That's the way the world is growing. By the time the Industrial Revolution has ended and a couple of more decades, say by 1900 or so, I forget the exact date, he does calculations, growth has gone up to 2% per annum for the world. Now it is about 3% per annum. So before the Industrial Revolution to after the Industrial Revolution, from 2%, 0.2% per annum to 2% per annum, which means literally 10 times faster it is growing. And today's 3% per annum, if at the end of the digital revolution takes a similar leap, the 3% per annum will be something that we can't even imagine, 30% per annum. But I, first of all, don't think that that's impossible. It's going to create a turbulent world, but the conception of what constitutes GDP will probably be very, very different. We are not even able to think of. And at one level, of course, the economics profession allows for that, but we are not yet sufficiently aware. If we take in if we stop doing regular work, we are getting our food and basic needs. Beyond that, I am listening to music, looking at art, reading philosophy. At one level, these things should be measured as a part of the pie that we are consuming. If we do that, and if that kind of a GDP grows 10 times faster than we are growing now, that can be a sustainable growth. We could go into a peaceful, possible world, but once again, we will have to rethink very categories by which we are calculating and measuring the total pie. I'm just literally giving you my thought as you were speaking, things that were collecting in my head. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the question of property is a fascinating one, and it's one that I've worked on for the work that I've done in the history of Egypt in the 19th century, trying to understand both how agricultural land was transformed into what we would recognize as private property, and what was involved in that in terms of not only transformations in law, but in forms of coercion, because if you're going to use new property rights to evict people, you've got to have new levels of coercion and so on. So property is a fantastic thing to think about historically, and the ways in which it's been both brought into being, but also resisted as something that is not always a good. I referred to the paper that has the same title as this webinar, the work of Economics, which is about the property titling program in Peru. And one of the things that I was drawing attention to is the history of people resisting formal private property rights because of the experience that what having a private right over land is, it's the risk of dispossession. And so the kinds of politics that emerge around property, because once you have property not only to sell but also to mortgage, then increasing demands can be put on you, or lower wages can be paid for you, because you can always get by mortgaging it, and then of course you find yourself in default and you lose your property, which is a much harder outcome in a system without those kinds of formal property rights. So there's this assumption, of course, that one finds in a lot of mainstream economics, that property and property rights is not only a good, it is sort of the good at the basis of capitalism. But the other thing I'd say coming out of our discussion is we tend to have a rather sort of static view, as it were, of property. It's this claim you have over a good that you can then, it gives you the right to alienate it, to enter into a commercial transaction. But in the same history that I've been gesturing towards from the late 19th century, of the rise of the stock market and of ways of acquiring income from the future, that seems to me a different way to think about property, as more along the lines you were thinking of, as a process of assetization. That is to say, is a process of thinking, what out here in the world that goes on can one turn into a private asset, understanding an asset as a claim, not necessarily on a physical thing, but on an income stream. So that one of the things that undergoes the process of assetization in that period I'm talking about in the late 19th century is the thing we know as the company share, the corporate share. It's very interesting work by legal historian in Britain, showing actually by studying the records of wills, that the changing way in which the existence of company shares in somebody's inheritance was changed. The first half of the 19th century, a share was just a claim on some physical property. It represented your 1/4 of the family's warehouse or the factory that you were a partner in, and so on. So it's not itself a form of property. It's a claim on something that is physical property, to which you might add some goodwill and some non-physical element. By the end of the 19th century, a share has become property. It has become this entitlement to the future profits, the dividends paid by a company in and of itself. And so what you can then do, and what this sudden takeoff of stock markets is, you can trade it as a form of property. So it's a very interesting case of something that has existed historically, namely having shares in some sort of business adventure for a long time, but through a whole series of subtle changes in law and the way it's treated, in stock markets and the way they work, in the way the courts adjudicate the rights of a shareholder as against to the rights of other claimants on a business, gradually transform that into property. And I think we're continuing to live with those kinds of transformations, where various kinds of claims, and you mentioned sort of digital examples and many others, get transformed into this claim on the future. And you mentioned, houses as an example. You could trace a similar history over a not very different period, but probably more into the 20th century, where a home goes from essentially something that is purchased for the cost of its construction and then lived in, to it becoming this asset that can then be, first of all, with the rise of mortgage industries, it means that the price of a home becomes not the cost of construction, but the value of living in that piece of property over the next 30 years, which might be 4 or 5 or 6 times the cost of construction. That difference is just described as the value of land, but the value of land is simply created by the availability of that mortgage system that suddenly makes it possible to assetize, to charge the value of living there over the next 30 years. And one by one can see aspects of life, university education might be another one, where the value can be recalculated in terms of, if we can set it up through some system of credit or some system of loan and going into debt, so that the value is now understood, not in terms of what it actually costs to build or to do that particular thing, but what is the value to the person who will go into debt to have that claim on that asset over a period of time. And I think that's a fundamental shift in what property is, to sort of think of it as a process of assetization rather than simply, how many of X goods have you got, that has had various histories. And I've just gestured to one in the 19th century, one in the early 20th century, and I think we could think of digital transformations today that are the same thing, that are taking areas of life and turning them into future revenue streams that can be assetized and then traded in the present as claims on that future.
Wasn't there an American company, I'll have to check, which was trying to start a market where you could buy shares in people's education? Then for the rest of your life, you get 5% of whatever that person is making because you bought a share in that person. There was an effort to do that. I'll have to check this up. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just saying one thing about the right that you're talking about, an early interest of mine is on property. There are two kinds of minimally two kinds of rights, which are very important to distinguish. Some are rights where you also have the right to give up that right, sell that right. And there are some rights where you are not allowed to sell that right. And we may need to think through, we do it usually spontaneously. I have the right to my home and I have the right to sell that home. I have a right to my kidney, but I don't have the right to sell that kidney in many countries, in many societies. So it's a right without the right to give up that right. And when we should have it, when we should have a central block on that is something that we usually go with just knee-jerk emotions, that these are things you don't allow to do. And these are, I became sensitive to this from my own city where I was born and grew up in Calcutta. There were a set of homes that this government, very well-meaning government, I think, sold to people. And they were worried that the rich would buy from them. So you got the houses, but you did not have the right to sell that house anymore. And this, of course, hurt the people because they lost mobility. If you get a better job in the Middle East, you can't go because you can't sell this home. So you're stuck with this home. So there are these categories where we may need to think through once we think of the fundamentals of many of these concepts.
Right. But you realize it's a site where it's not just a matter of deciding a property right, but is actually designing those rights in such a way that they prevent speculation, but they allow mobility. And what are the elements of actually constructing and designing that that form of property that it'll work in that kind of way? I don't know how much longer we should go, but there was perhaps one. Fuad, how are we doing?
Yeah, go. Why don't you go ahead, and then we'll, as questions come, I might interfere. And
okay. You were talking in your first remarks, Kaushik, about thinking about what it is that's built into the woodwork of a discipline, and you gave the example of trade, and what is it that causes trade to expand. And you mentioned two axioms that are made explicit: greed, you've got to want more, and the law of diminishing marginal utility, that after you've got a lot of something, its utility to you diminishes relative to other wants. I'm interested that, partly because of the interest in the sort of longer history of trade, even from before the kinds of periods we've been talking about, largely prior to the 19th century, the various forms of long distance trade, often centered, some of them importantly centered in the Middle East, in Cairo and other places where I've worked, and stretching across Asia, the Middle East, into Europe. Trying to think of that as the dominant form that credit creation took prior to these forms I've been talking about a current interest in around stock markets and the large-scale creation of utilities and railways and things in the late 19th century. That prior to the late 19th century, international trade, long-distance trade, was the major way in which you created credit. So first of all, as far as we know, pretty much all trade, not only long distance, but even local, operated on the form of credit. And it made particular use of bills of exchange, where there's a paper referring to the delivery of the goods. And what can then be done, of course, is that piece of paper in advance of the bill of goods can be traded at a discount, so that the person they can get that money right away if they're willing to take less than the face amount of the value. And that process of discounting bills of trade, of course, is a very major part of the history of both international finance, but also of international commerce. once you begin to understand that, and you understand that the large merchant houses were actually involved in this continuous process of actually profiting as much from the discounting of the bill of trade as of the actual difference in price between the purchasing and the selling of the goods, then you begin to develop a different view of the history of international trade and even how we should think of trade, that it's actually as much a form of financial activity as a form of commercial activity. And in terms of your, what's built into the woodwork, what the assumptions are about what's driving a particular system of trade, that what's at work is not simply a desire in one place and a supply in another place, but actually this sort of operates simply as the vehicle, or in very important ways as the vehicle for the creation and extension of credit, and that what we're actually looking at is not a world organized around need for, desire for things between buyers and sellers, but a world of capital in looking for profit, where the profit will come not from the arbitrage between price in one place and price in another, but for the extending out of time, because the longer the trade route, the greater the opportunity to extend credit. The bill that involved will be a 6 month or a 12 months rather than a 2 month or a 3 month, and therefore the discounting and thus the profit will be more. So there's a whole way in which sort of to make sense of that world, one's actually sort of not just to, as it were, to see what's built into the woodwork, but not assume from the beginning that the motor of this process is these two elements of greed and surplus, presumably to meet the need for that greed, the need represented by that greed. But there's something else going on that has to do with the history of capital and credit.
One very, my direct experience of something closely related to this, the advising that I was doing to the Indian government, I started in 2009 when the subprime crisis had already happened in the United States. The real economy was not feeling it too much as yet, but the financial world was in a tizzy. I joined the Indian government. One sector which began to do very badly, and I was very new in this task, began to do very badly, and it took us a little bit of time to realize what was going wrong. Trade was suddenly stuttering and stammering, the Indian international trade. And it was at first sight very difficult to understand because the production capacity was the same, international demand notionally is the same, supply demand, so what's going wrong? It's short-term credit. As credit was drying up, the financial market was drying up, the short-term credit which you need, not for a very long stretch of time, but I will give you the goods today, you will pay after 2 months. Or you pay me now, then 2 months later, I will sell the goods. Requires this short-term credit, and because most of the time it takes place, it generates a lot of profit for people who are in this short-term credit market. But because it plays so silently, you don't even realize the importance of this in international trade, that this actually fuels gets the nuts and bolts of international trade going. And I remember those days, we were all wondering a little bit as to what's going on, but soon you realize this is happening. And then you, of course, get the government to step in temporarily to provide these kinds of credit. Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps we should begin taking questions here. Thank you both very much. Really very stimulating conversation on the complexities of and the various mechanisms and theories and ideas around this idea of the economy and the new forms they might be taking. I think this idea of the futures, in a way, a futures kind of market is extremely interesting and powerful. There is one question here, and I think it's for you, Kaushik. It's about economics as an area of inquiry that faces, repeated regular crisis, and every crisis, but because the whole framework, he says, or she says, is an anonymous attendee, is not created to find the truth, but to accommodate politics. especially the politics around the finding ways to rationalize and ignore the miseries and violence of the world. So I guess, to what extent is economics and economics self-reflexive about what it is that crises tell us? And I think, if I could just add to that, Kaushik, I remember reading Krugman in one of his columns in the New York Times after the 2009, 2008 financial meltdown on Wall Street, that it was one of these huge developments that economists had not predicted or anticipated. So I guess this person is asking, what happens after crisis, right? What happens to this kind of self-questioning of assumptions and so on?
On this, I'm actually more generous to the economics profession. There are certain things, of course, that the profession is banding around to sort of prop up vested interests. Some of it does happen unwittingly, you do that. But I don't think a vast majority of people are doing that. They are trying to understand the system, but you go along with it. But on crisis, I have one very interesting thought. Some crises are virtually impossible. The discipline is not yet at a level where we can predict these. So yes, we miss out on huge crises, but that must not also make us dismiss everything else in economics. When in the government of India, I would repeatedly stress that there are many large areas of macroeconomics we understand very little. Still, we have to do something, and we do. But there are other areas. Auction is one of those where the understanding is very deep and you cannot sort of put it all together. And fact that you fail in one domain, take it across the board. And the failure on prediction of these major cycles, there is another very deep, almost fundamental reason to understand. If there ever existed an economist who could predict a stock market crash 1 month in advance, 1 month before it happens, whenever this economist makes that prediction, the crash would take place immediately, because you know that this person can do that. So not having an economist who can predict a stock market crash or a currency crash a month in advance is definitionally true, because if you had that, then the crash would take place immediately. It would be impossible to have that space. So there is something definitional in certain crashes where it's impossible to do it. So I feel Krugman also came I remember actually those writings of Krugman very soon after the crisis, came very tough, but there are certain virtual impossibilities that you can't do. That is there. Now, on the vested interest and the economics propping up, there are some, I'm sure, who do it because it's in their interest to do that. But a lot of it is also when you are a part of a slow process of thinking, you begin to internalize some of these vested interests, and it becomes a part of your systemic thinking. What you do about that is not immediately clear. In fact, you need very, very novel, striking thinkers to help you rupture and break out of this. And that is not within everyone's realm to be able to do that. So yes, that is a part of unwitting part of economics that we live by.
Okay. So there's a second question. It's not to anyone specifically, but it's about the implications of the rise of China with its own state capitalist model. To what extent does that question, a series of fundamentals of economic theory as we've taught it or thought about it? Maybe Kaushik, you want to start with that too.
Yeah. The state as running the full system, first of all, it doesn't, of course, happen in China. But still, the state is much more major. And there were estimates of, if you take the GDP and the share of the GDP that comes out of state-owned enterprises, China is much higher than India, than United States, than Korea, than most other countries. So yes, the state is very important. But whether this can take over as a model for the world, I'm skeptical. And the reason for my skepticism is USSR and its experience. Once you begin to centralize and run a system, a lot of it is luck, the luck of a good leader. If you have a good leader, a selfless leader, it could run. But it is also a very, very big risk of the following kind, that when you're amassing a lot of wealth in the hand of the state, there are lots of prying eyes trying to capture that. And what we saw happening in the USSR is really the mass which had come under the state control ultimately became a crony control. So in fact, it was a socialist system that morphed into crony capitalism with a few big individuals capturing what the state had got together. It was too attractive a pie to be sitting over there. So it became sort of crony deals being cut between the state and a few big businesses in Russia that captured it. I feel that's invariably the risk. You will have to think in terms of systems where individuals will do a lot of the trade and business. Where my hope lies is something which sounds very idyllic, but I think that there is hope in that, that human beings can come to acquire values of fairness, which despite having individual enterprise and trade, we can create a more equitable society. And one reason for that is you can find small groups that do have these values being nurtured. And the smallest group, the example is the refrigerator in a household or even in a joint family. I started my life in a joint family of about 30 people with lots of common refrigerator-like places. That was a classic commons problem, but we never faced a commons problem because there was enough understanding between the group that you don't take more than what you're supposed to take. There is actually a recent paper by Ariel Rubinstein, very mainstream economics, stressing Rubinstein and Richter, stressing the place of these kinds of norms and values and how this can lead to a very, very different world. I feel our belief that we are hardwired to make as much as possible for ourselves is not true. And my hope lies that we can do this, mindsets can change to make a much better world possible. And this, I'm not at all saying this in an idealistic way. I do believe it's possible. And I think if we pay sensitive attention to different societies and cultures, we will see that there are many other values that human beings do use in their everyday lives, and that can come into play. And the hope for the world, the idealistic world, is the gradual nurture and development of these values.
Okay, thank you. There's a question. I'm going to call up Phil McMichael to pose his own question, but if you would like, you could see in the chat function, in the question and answers session, 2 quotes that he's put up, and he'd like to ask you both to comment on that. It relates to the evolution of economic thought. Can you see that?
I'm not seeing
Yeah, there's a separate button for Q&A.
Okay, it's under the question and answer. Phil, you want to come in on this?
Sorry, yeah. Me?
You can start, Tim.
Yeah, while I'm
Okay, sure. So thank you, Phil. It's nice to hear your words. The quotes are great, and of course, they're quotes both referring to this specific aspect of capitalism over the last century and a half, but so absolutely dominant today, which is the power of the large corporation. The Milton Friedman is pushing, of course, that that view all the way back in 1962, that no matter how large and no matter how powerful corporations became, they should serve no interest other than, I don't know, at that stage he was saying no interest other than shareholders. He might have had a slightly broader view of corporate interest then than the one that emerged later. And of course, that reflects the underlying sort of Hayekian view that the best way to promote a collective good is for everybody to do their own, pursue their own economic interests. But the problem is when those economic interests are pursued by an entity of the kind of scale that corporations have become, then the failure to take into account public goods becomes more and more untenable. And we see that today with issues like climate change. If an oil corporation is only going to pursue the interests of oil production and exploration, and is politically powerful enough to get away with that through its influence on the political process, then we're in trouble. And that's just the most obvious example right across the collective world we live in. I don't think we've got a proper theory, a political theory of the corporation. Corporations came into being about the same time as modern states. Some of them actually were so powerful they became modern states. The East India Company morphed into the modern state of India, or parts of what became the modern state of India, and many other areas of the world were colonized by colonizing corporations that were the most powerful entities of their day. And although they pursued an economic objective, they were thoroughly political. And somewhere this separation came. Oh no, corporations are economic entities and politics is some other sphere, but they never ceased having that kind of political power and that kind of political role. So the question is, how best do you think about the corporation as one of the most powerful entities in our collective lives, and the ways of either policing them or directing them towards public purposes? So stakeholder capitalism is one example of that, positioning private corporations as trustees of society. Obviously, that's preferable to the notion of the corporation as operating only in the interests of its shareholders and not of wider stakeholders. It still tends to leave the size and the power of the corporation unquestioned if it's just about making them trustees. And there's nothing particularly democratic about the role of a trustee. So the notion that you get to keep all your power, but you've got to be a little more benign in the way you exercise it and think of yourself more as a trustee than just a profit maker. I think there are far more democratic ways than that to think about organizing control over economic processes.
I want to jump in, Phil. Very good to see you virtually after a long time. With the Milton Friedman's comment, I actually totally disagree. I feel there is a larger commitment, which no matter what you are, whether you're a corporation, you have that, and that social responsibility. And I feel if Milton Friedman were around today in the age of COP26, I feel he would take back some of that there are responsibilities which go beyond the responsibility towards your stockholders, unless, of course, you have such a good futures market that the future is being represented fully through their interests now then. But no, I mean, you do need responsibility all around. And Schwab's also, I would have a reservation. And on this, I have actually a very specific thing which I think we should strive towards, 2 suggestions, and it relates also to the earlier question which was asked. First of all, I think we do need to think in terms of laws, concrete laws about dispersed shareholding in corporations. So if a corporation became mega wealthy, it would not matter if there were laws saying that no one can own more than a certain percentage of the corporation, pretty finely sliced up, so that it's held by a very, very large number of shareholders. So we do need laws about dispersed shareholding of corporations so that when they make mega profits, it does not go into just a few pockets these. And another thing, I do believe that in the end, private enterprise is going to play a role. You have to allow for that. But government should not make the mistake that USSR had made, that is collect it all in the middle and sit there for someone to come and grab and take it away and convert socialism into crony capitalism. Not that. What government should do, and this we should have strict rules, is redistribution. Great inequality is utterly wrong. What you need the government to do, therefore, is not get ownership of everything and produce everything, but have tax and transfer very quick, so the government does not become big, but it is a mechanism for taxing very rich people, transferring a part of the money. It can be done through dispersed shareholding, through profit sharing rules in society, through universal basic income, but the government has to play a very major and very radical role in chopping off income at the top, wealth at the top, transferring that to the bottom, but not sit on it because it becomes too attractive a pie if you're sitting on this. So that's what we should aspire towards.
A similar point made by those trying to think about how to reform and limit the power of corporations, because of course creating any public corporation requires, is part of a legal process, is simply to change that legal process, for example, by saying that shares expire after 10 years. Right. Completely changes the meaning, the power of a share. And a share is just a claim on a share of income for a certain period. Make it something that's limited in time, which immediately limits the amount that it can expand. The amount of unearned income and the amount of future income that is being purchased in the present.
Yeah, never thought of that, but this just alerts me that actually there's a lot of novelty that can come into the nature of holding of shares, so that the corporation's big profit does not have to become one individual's huge profit. Yeah.
Tim, there's a question for you here from Aman Banerjee. It says, your paper suggests the centrality of natural experiments, economics as a discipline. Do I guess either of you believe this remains the case today? Or how has economics evolved methodologically in the last decade? And how might the growing engagement with the national economy as an object of study in a number of related disciplines like anthropology offer new opportunities to engage with the making of the economy?
Well, I can come in with a thought. Natural experiments have begun to play a very, very major role in economics and in the understanding of the world. One concrete example which immediately jumps to mind is a beautiful paper by Esther Duflo and Raghav Chattopadhyay, very famous paper by Duflo and Chattopadhyay. We very often used to wonder that electing women leaders, does it lead to better outcomes in local governments if a woman is a leader? There's some correlation. Women leaders have better outcomes, but it could be that more progressive villages elect women. So you find better indicators of the village and women leaders. So the causality is not the other way around. What Raghav Chattopadhyay and Esther Duflo did was, in India, the government changed, almost facilitating research by economists, saying that 1/3 of local governments, the constitution was amended, 1/3 of local governments selected randomly have women leaders. So here the choice of the woman leader has nothing to do with how progressive the village is. It was done by the toss of a coin. And they collected this massive data and then found actually those villages where women were being chosen by this random draw of those villages were doing better in terms of the provision of public goods. This has started. A lot of the natural experiments being done is actually having an impact on economics. But I do also believe that the old-fashioned economic theory that goes back to the 19th century, which is staring at the world, taking in the thick descriptions of what's happening around you, and then trying to conceptualizing that in our head is crucially important. Some of the biggest breakthroughs, the most fundamental understandings come not for waiting for a natural experiment or a randomized trial, but literally taking in the thick descriptions of the world that is all around us and having the sort of ability to take that and conceptualizing that should continue.
I'm less equipped to talk about what's happening within economics as a discipline, rather someone watching it from outside. And obviously natural experiments and randomized control trials have become enormously popular. And these poverty labs that people like Esther Duflo and at Chicago and elsewhere, the other one at Chicago and Yale and elsewhere, are extraordinarily large and successful operations, attracting millions of dollars in funding, many multiples of millions, and employing extraordinary numbers of researchers. As you know from, or would see from my little article that we've been referring to on the work of economics, I think digging into what's going on with these natural experiments, including those that are deemed a success, often reveals quite significant problems in either how the success is being measured or how the experiment itself has been set up. And of course, one of the most famous of these was the one about deworming in East Africa, where it was attempted to replicate it and it proved impossible to replicate it, and all kinds of aspects of the finding. But at that point, the paper had taken off and become famous across the field. And as a method, this had proved itself enormously popular. There have been some interesting studies attempting to explain this popularity, including one by a colleague of mine here in sociology at Columbia, Gil Ayal, suggesting that there's this sort of confluence, this coming together of a sort of an impasse in economics about where to go forward, where to do exciting new work because of the exhaustion of other sort of less experimental, less real world kinds of research, with a certain need of development agencies, in particular the rise of the sort of philanthro-capitalist NGOs, the Gates Foundations and things like this, that had a much more of a sort of business mentality and a demand for evidence about what worked. And the experimental economics rises at the same time as you have this massive new source of funding. And they sort of meet each other and seem to benefit. But so I think there are interesting reasons for the sudden explosion of this kind of research over the last decade or so. But I think there's also reason to look very closely at the kind, not only at the, whether the design is not right, there's also often the ethical issue of sort of treating people as laboratory patients, as it were, or patients in a medical-like field experiment, which has a lot of ethical issues attached to it. There's also the complaint made. I think Sanjay Reddy has made this in a nice little article called For Economics, taking the title of Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee's book. There's only certain kinds of remedies that can be tried at this scale. And the way it differs from an earlier kind of economics is not just in the particular method or the particular experimental sort of truth it's producing, but where in a country do you think change has to happen? And of course, the emphasis here is almost entirely at the level of the village or the household or the small community. And that tends to exclude other kinds of political approaches at the level of government, state, national, community, and so on.
Thank you, Tim. It's nice to see a message from Boris Olpaduala here for us. I think it's a bit of tongue-in-cheek for you, Professor Basu. He says, your hopes for a more humane future brings to mind Che Guevara's ideas on the new man. And he gives two citations, though, one from the American Economic Association presidential address, I'm not sure which year, by Leontiev, called in a paper presentation entitled Theoretical Assumptions and Non-Observed Facts, and another one by Charles Sellers on the market revolution, which he says recalls some of the arguments of Polanyi's great transformation. Maybe I could use that provocation in some ways from Boris to ask you, Mitchell, about your conception of this making of the economy, the invention of the economy, and in what ways it relates to or departs from the kinds of arguments that Polanyi himself makes about the institution of the economy, of a self-regulating market, actually, is how he puts it, right?
Well, Polanyi is obviously a major text, and I teach it and read it often. But I think it's also one that's misread, including misread by himself, because in his subsequent articles, he presented what he'd written in the book in 1947, whenever it was published, differently. Because in his later articles, he said this was about the birth of the economy, which in the book and in the later articles he saw as emerging in the 19th century. But when he wrote the book, and he was writing it and giving it as lectures in the 1930s, he didn't call it the economy because the word wasn't still widely used in that sense. His analysis of what happened in the book was the emergence of what he called market society, which of course he defined as society in which markets were no longer these small enclaves contained by all kinds of regulations that limited their spread, the existence of guilds, the existence of fixed prices, the existence of various forms of management and control of long distance trade, to this sort of breaking out and this spread of a market principle much more widely. And then society is that which emerges to try and contain this explosion, in particular by trying to note that there are three things in life that if you treat them as a market, things collapse. And one is human life or labor itself, and the second is nature. I mean, land as it's thought of as an agricultural commodity, but nature more broadly is limited and can't be priced properly by markets. And the third, and most interesting in a way, was money, because of course he was writing in the aftermath of this great financial crisis of the interwar period. He had lived through it in Central Europe himself, and has a very vivid description of what it means when an entire currency system and financial order collapses. And that's what motivated the writing of the book, to try and understand what happens in these three realms, and particularly in the financial realm, when you try and treat something that is a market, which isn't a market, because money, as he argued, is not a commodity created for immediate consumption. It's an entire system apparatus of credit. So I think as long as you don't misread the book as being about the invention of the economy in the 19th century, but rather see it about as this vast expansion of principles of the market, I think it's an absolutely brilliant book. But in shorthand, it's often said, oh, Polanyi tells you that the economy was invented in the 19th century. It doesn't say that in the book.
Very interesting. Okay, so we're running out of time. So why don't I invite you to, if you want to make any closing remarks before we wind up.
Let me then just say something connected to what Porras is saying, and Fuad, what you also said. I'm delighted to see that Porras has not changed at all, having moved to New Mexico. So his question shows. Porras, actually, I do believe in that, in the end, it is the new creature that we will be that gives hope. And it's connected to what Fuad you said. So it's a perfect closing for me, that can we rely on self-enforcement? Or does there have to be pressure from outside for us to behave better? I feel in the end, we have no choice but self-enforcement, for the following reason, that we think of outside enforcement when we actually artificially construct the economy as individual players and someone from outside controlling us, the state. But once you begin to think of the state also as individuals, in the end, we have nothing but individuals all over. What we have achieved today, it is true that our profit-making behavior is being controlled by some other people putting rules and regulations, but they are also individuals. So what we have achieved up to now, a reasonably prosperous world, is an achievement of self-enforcement in this all-encompassing sense, because there is nothing else but self-enforcement. Going from here to the next stage, we have to pause collectively, that we have to create a better self-enforcing society with rules and regulations, but which is also coming out of us. So in the end, we have nothing else. We may vanish the way the dinosaur has gone. We may vanish. We may not succeed the next step of reorganizing ourselves. But the only hope is this, that we will become better creatures, create better regulations, but all out of ourselves, because there is no one outside ourselves. I'll stop with that.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Tim, is there any
I don't know if I can be as grand as that. I'll actually go in the opposite direction, just for contrast. Part of what got me interested in studying things like the history of GDP and how it's calculated and how the national income and product accounts are put together is because that actually shows you a place you can work on politics on a less grand level, because once you understand not only that this is a set of conventions and assumptions about what should be priced and what shouldn't be priced, but even within, for example, that figure for the GDP, there's a line within it. It's called the production line, that determines that some things are counted, as it were, as costs, and some are products. Some are actually counted as transfers because they're not contributing overall, and others. And there's a history of how things move across that production frontier. And there's very interesting work showing how in early versions of the GDP, finance was counted as a cost imposed on us. And then at a certain point, in a number of stages and revisions, it just got moved across the production boundary so that the entire world of finance and real estate and insurance and so on, that's what, 20% of GDP, could become productive. Now that is a political transformation done with figures inside the calculation of a statistical world. And I think there's something to be said for thinking about the possibilities for forms of political action and political intervention that work on those kinds of levels, whether not just at the level of thinking about GDP, but exactly the same with questions that have come in the comments about things like rates of corporate profit. I mean, a rate of corporate profit of an oil company is based on assumption that we're going to go to 6 degrees centigrade. And some of the interesting politics is actually getting into the filings of those companies with the SEC and showing this is the degree of global warming built into that corporate share price. And there's a vulnerability to that kind of politics of calculation and calculability. In that kind of attention, I think one can open up interesting new political spaces.
Okay, well, perfect. Thank you so much. Really appreciate both of you for your time and for your diligence. It's over 2 hours, and I put all the onus on you to do the talking. I really appreciate it, and thank you very much. I'm sure most of us feel very enlightened by the exchange you've had. I wish we could have done it in person, but this is the best second option, I guess, available to us. Again, thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Yeah.